In the early morning hours of March 4, 2026, a formation of American strike aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace on one of the most complex and dangerous combat missions in a generation. There were F-22s threading through layered air defense networks, their low observable coatings, and carefully managed electronic signatures meant to deny Iranian radar operators the targeting solution they needed to engage. Behind them came F-15s loaded with bunker-penetrating munitions, aircraft carrying weapons designed specifically to reach hardened underground facilities where centrifuge cascades had been spinning for years. F-16s were assigned to suppression of enemy air defenses, carrying anti-radiation missiles programmed with the frequency profiles of Iranian surface-to-air missile radars. Electronic warfare platforms jammed radar frequencies across a front that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea. It was a layered, coordinated, mutually supporting strike package of extraordinary complexity, representing the combined effort of hundreds of planners, thousands of maintainers, and dozens of crews who had spent weeks preparing for this night. None of those aircraft could have reached their targets. None of them could have stayed on station long enough to complete their missions. None of them could have made it home without an airplane that most Americans have never heard of. That airplane was the KC-135 Stratotanker, and on that morning it was operating exactly as it has operated in every major American air campaign since Vietnam, as the invisible backbone of air power projection, the platform that makes everything else possible, the airplane that nobody talks about until the day it is not there. Operation Epic Fury, the American-Israeli air campaign against Iran that began February 28, 2026, has placed extraordinary demands on the tanker fleet. Iran is not a small country. Its nuclear infrastructure is buried deep, dispersed across a geography that stretches roughly 1,600 kilometers from its western border with Iraq to its eastern reaches near the Afghan frontier. The Fordow enrichment facility is dug into a mountain near Qom. The Natanz complex is hardened beneath meters of reinforced concrete. The Isfahan conversion facility is hundreds of kilometers from the nearest friendly airbase. Strike aircraft flying from carriers in the Persian Gulf, from bases in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, and in some cases from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, are pushing the limits of their unrefueled combat radius on nearly every mission. Without aerial refueling, many of those strikes simply do not happen. The distances are too great. The fuel margins are too thin. The time on station required to prosecute hardened targets with precision munitions is too demanding. The mathematics of combat radius are unforgiving. An F-15E Strike Eagle, one of the primary strike aircraft in the Epic Fury campaign, has an unrefueled combat radius of roughly 1,300 kilometers when carrying a full internal fuel load and a meaningful weapons payload. That sounds like a lot until you look at a map and realize that the distance from Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates to the Fordow facility near Qom is approximately 1,400 kilometers in a straight line, and that in practice the route must avoid certain airspace, account for the fuel burned during climb to altitude, and preserve enough fuel for a meaningful loiter over the target area and a safe recovery to base or to a divert field. The arithmetic only works if there is a tanker somewhere along the route. There has to be a tanker going in, and there has to be a tanker available for the recovery. In many cases, there has to be a tanker available for an emergency offload if an aircraft encounters a problem that causes it to burn more fuel than planned. In the opening days of Epic Fury, KC-135s were operating in two primary roles. The first was bridge tanking, positioning themselves in orbits over Iraq, over the northern Persian Gulf, and over international waters in the Arabian Sea to extend the reach of strike packages flying into Iran from multiple directions simultaneously. The second role was emergency tanking, holding on station within range of strike aircraft that might be damaged, that might have burned more fuel than planned due to threat-driven maneuvering, or that might need to divert from a primary recovery base due to Iranian ballistic missile attacks on coalition airfields. In at least several documented incidents in the first 2 weeks of the campaign, KC-135s provided emergency fuel to aircraft that would otherwise have been lost, either forced to eject over hostile or uncertain territory, or forced to divert to a location where the aircraft and crew might not have been recovered intact. The tanker orbits themselves require careful coordination and constant adjustment. Iranian surface-to-air missile systems, including modernized variants of the S-300 and domestically produced systems, like the Bavar 373, have long-range engagement envelopes that force tanker orbits well back from the threat. The Bavar 373, which Iran claims is analogous in capability to the Russian S-300, has a stated engagement range of approximately 200 kilometers against aircraft-sized targets, though the actual operational performance of the system under contested conditions is subject to debate among analysts. Regardless of the precise capability, the existence of these systems means that tanker orbits must be planned with significant standoff distance from known battery locations, and that the tanker tracks must be continuously reassessed as the air campaign degrades or relocates Iranian air defense assets. The result of this standoff requirement is that strike aircraft must fly a considerable distance from the tanker orbit to the threat boundary, execute their mission, and then fly back out to the tanker again before recovering to base. This sequence of events, sometimes called the push-pull cycle, doubles the distance that must be covered under fuel stress compared to a mission where a tanker could hold closer to the target area. On long missions, a strike aircraft may require 3 separate refueling events: one before entering the threat environment, one immediately after egressing the threat, and one on the way home if the recovery base is distant or if the aircraft has burned more fuel than planned. Each of those events requires a tanker to be in the right place at the right time, with the right amount of fuel available. The Air Force has been flying KC-135s continuously since the campaign began. Crews are operating on compressed crew rest schedules, with the minimum rest periods allowed by Air Force regulations being applied routinely rather than as exceptions. Aircraft are being turned around with minimal ground time, with maintenance crews working through the night to fix discrepancies, service engines, and ensure that aircraft are ready for the next scheduled departure. The tanker fleet, which has been aging for decades and which the Air Force has struggled to recapitalize through a procurement process plagued by delays, protests, and program restructuring, is being pushed hard in ways that its designers never fully anticipated, and that its maintainers handle through sheer professionalism and experience. And yet the Stratotanker keeps flying. It keeps flying because it was built with a margin of ruggedness and reliability that has sustained it across more than 6 decades of continuous operational service, and because the crews and maintainers who keep it flying bring an institutional knowledge and dedication that is inseparable from the aircraft's history. There is another dimension to the tanker's role in epic fury that rarely gets discussed in public reporting. The KC-135 is not just moving fuel. It is serving as a node in the theater communication architecture, relaying targeting data, battle damage assessment information, and command and control traffic between aircraft that are beyond line-of-sight communication range with ground stations. It is providing a reference point for strike package timing, with tanker orbits serving as the coordination anchors around which complex multi-aircraft strike packages deconflict their timing and routing. And it is providing a psychological safety net for crews, who know that if something goes wrong over Iran, if an engine fails, if a fuel system malfunctions, if battle damage creates an unexpected fuel state, there is a tanker waiting for them on the other side of the threat boundary. That knowledge changes the way crews execute their missions. They fly more aggressively, they hold longer over difficult targets, they take the second pass when they need it rather than aborting the mission, because they know the tanker is there. To understand why the KC-135 matters so much in a campaign like Epic Fury, you have to understand what the airplane actually does, how it does it, and what it takes to make that happen at scale across a combat theater. The KC-135 Stratotanker is a large, 4-engine jet aircraft designed specifically to refuel other aircraft in flight. It is operated by the United States Air Force, and by a small number of allied air forces that have acquired the type, including France, Singapore, Turkey, and Chile. The aircraft is roughly 41 meters long, with a wingspan of roughly 40 meters and a maximum takeoff weight of approximately 146,000 kilograms, in its current operational configuration. That weight is almost entirely fuel. The KC-135 can carry approximately 90,000 kilograms of transferable fuel in its integral wing tanks and its large fuselage-mounted fuel tank, though the exact amount available for offload on any given mission depends on the aircraft's own fuel consumption getting to the refueling orbit, the distance of that orbit from the operating base, and the planned duration of the refueling track. A tanker that burns 30,000 kilograms of fuel flying to a distant orbit and back has only 60,000 kilograms to give away, and it must always retain enough fuel for a safe recovery, including a reserve for weather diversions and holding. The heart of the KC-135's capability is its flying boom system. The boom is a rigid telescoping tube mounted beneath the tail of the aircraft, extending rearward and downward at an angle that positions its tip below and behind the tanker's fuselage. The boom is operated by a dedicated crew member called the boom operator, who occupies a prone position in a dedicated compartment in the rear of the fuselage, lying on a padded surface and looking aft through a large observation window. The boom operator uses aerodynamic control surfaces attached to the boom called ruddervators, small movable surfaces that act like a combination of rudder and elevator, to fly the boom's tip into a receptacle opening on the top of the receiving aircraft's fuselage. When the boom tip enters the receptacle and the latching mechanism engages, fuel begins to flow through the boom at high pressure into the receiver's fuel system. The boom can telescope to extend its reach across a range of roughly 4.5 to 6 meters from its retracted to its extended position, allowing it to accommodate receivers flying in a range of positions relative to the tanker. The fuel transfer rate through the boom system can reach approximately 1,100 gallons per minute under ideal conditions, which translates to roughly 4,200 liters per minute. In practice, operational transfer rates are typically lower, in the range of 600 to 900 gallons per minute, because most receiving aircraft have fuel system inflow limitations that prevent them from accepting fuel at the maximum rate the boom can provide. An F-15, for example, can typically accept fuel at a rate of around 600 gallons per minute. A B-52, with its large fuel capacity and multiple feed points, can accept fuel more quickly. The total time required to refuel an aircraft from a low fuel state to full tanks varies from a few minutes for a small fighter to 20 minutes or more for a large bomber. The boom operator's job is one of the most specialized and demanding positions in military aviation, and it is one that is entirely unique to the United States Air Force, which is the only Air Force in the world that operates the flying boom system as its primary refueling method. The boomer does not fly the tanker. That is the responsibility of the pilots up front. The boomer flies the boom, which is attached to the tanker, but which has its own aerodynamic surfaces that give it limited independent movement within a defined envelope. In turbulent conditions, in darkness, at high altitude where the thin air makes aerodynamic control surfaces less effective, with a receiver aircraft flying in close formation just meters below and behind the tanker, the boomer must make constant small corrections to keep the boom engaged in the receiver's receptacle. Turbulence that causes the receiver to move up or down by even half a meter can cause a disconnect if the boomer does not anticipate and compensate in time. A disconnect in the wrong moment can cause a sudden fuel spill that coats the receiver's windscreen with JP-8 jet fuel, temporarily blinding the pilot. A hard contact, where the boom tip strikes the receptacle surround or adjacent structure instead of entering cleanly, can damage either the boom or the receiver aircraft. The skill required to be an effective boomer is developed over hundreds of hours of practice with diverse receiver types, in varied weather conditions, at night, over water, in combat. Experienced boomers develop an almost intuitive feel for the aerodynamic interaction between the tanker and the receiver, for the way that the bow wave from the tanker's wake affects the receiver's flight path, and for the subtle cues that tell them a disconnect is about to happen before the instruments confirm it. The best boomers are artists of a kind that the public never sees, performing precise and demanding work in the dark at the back of an airplane while the people they are supporting fly toward targets that are trying to kill them. The flying boom system has evolved considerably since the original design entered service in the 1950s. The original KC-135A used a purely optical sighting system in which the boomer looked directly through the observation window and judged the boom's position relative to the receiver by eye, using lighting marks on the tanker's belly and lights on the receiver to establish the proper geometry. This system worked but was demanding on the boomer's eyes in low-light conditions and provided no quantitative readout of boom position relative to the receiver's acceptable contact envelope. Over the decades, position lights, instrumentation, and eventually electronic displays have been added to give the boomer better situational awareness and to reduce the fatigue associated with long refueling evolutions. A director light system, which uses a row of lights on the tanker's belly to signal the receiver pilot whether to move forward, backward, up, or down, was added to help receiver pilots who were struggling to hold position in the boom envelope, particularly in turbulence or when fatigued after a long combat mission. In addition to the boom system, the KC-135 can be configured with a hose and drogue refueling capability. The most common configuration uses a centerline drogue adapter that attaches to the boom and converts it to deliver fuel through a flexible hose that trails behind the tanker with a basket-shaped drogue at its end. Probe-equipped receiving aircraft fly their refueling probes into the basket to make contact and receive fuel. The hose and drogue system transfers fuel at a significantly lower rate than the boom, approximately 300 to 400 gallons per minute, but it is compatible with a much wider range of aircraft. Navy and Marine Corps tactical aircraft are universally equipped with probes rather than boom receptacles, as are most Allied Air Force aircraft outside the United States. In a coalition operation like Epic Fury, where American aircraft must sometimes share tanker resources with British, French, Israeli, and other Allied aircraft, the ability to refuel probe-equipped aircraft is operationally significant. Some KC-135s have been fitted with wing-mounted refueling pods that allow the aircraft to refuel two probe-equipped aircraft simultaneously while also using the centerline boom. This multi-point refueling configuration significantly increases the tanker's throughput in situations where many aircraft need fuel in a short period of time, and it is particularly valuable when operating with coalition partners whose aircraft are probe-equipped. The KC-135's fuel system is a masterpiece of practical engineering. The aircraft carries its fuel in a series of interconnected tanks distributed through the wing structure and in a large fuselage tank that runs the length of the main cargo deck below the floor. The fuel system is designed so that fuel can be transferred between tanks in flight to manage the aircraft's center of gravity as fuel is consumed or offloaded. This center of gravity management is important because the KC-135, like all aircraft, must stay within defined weight and balance limits to remain controllable and efficient. As the fuselage tank empties during refueling operations, the aircraft's center of gravity shifts forward, and the fuel management system compensates by transferring fuel between wing tanks to maintain the correct balance. The pilots and boom operator can monitor the fuel state of all tanks from their respective stations and can override the automatic fuel management system when necessary to respond to unusual situations. The fuselage tank of the KC-135 is physically located where the main cargo deck would be on a transport aircraft. When the aircraft is used in its primary tanker role, this space is occupied by the tank and its associated plumbing and pumping equipment. When the aircraft is configured for the secondary transport role, the fuselage tank can be partially or fully removed and replaced with cargo pallets or passenger seats, giving the aircraft a secondary utility transport capability that has been used during deployments to move personnel and equipment when dedicated transport aircraft are not available. The structural life of the KC-135 has been one of the central concerns of Air Force logistics planning for decades. The original Boeing design was built to a service life measured in terms of flight cycles and flight hours that engineers in the late 1950s considered generous. What nobody could fully anticipate in 1957 was that these airframes would still be flying combat missions in 2026. The accumulated flight hours and pressurization cycles on the oldest aircraft in the fleet have pushed well beyond anything the original structural analysis contemplated, and the Air Force has had to invest heavily in structural inspection and repair programs to maintain airworthiness. Teams of structural engineers have conducted detailed analyses of the wing spars, fuselage frames, and skin panels on the oldest airframes, identifying areas where fatigue cracking has begun and developing repair procedures to extend the safe service life. In some cases, entire structural panels have been replaced. In other cases, doublers and reinforcements have been added to distribute loads away from cracked areas. The investment required to keep 60-year-old airframes flying safely is enormous, but the Air Force has continued to make it because there is no alternative that does not involve simply flying fewer tanker missions. The Block 45 avionics upgrade, which the Air Force has been implementing across the KC-135 fleet, represents one of the most comprehensive modernizations of the aircraft's cockpit and systems in recent years. The upgrade replaces aging avionics boxes that have become increasingly difficult to support logistically because manufacturers have stopped producing them and replacement parts are scarce. The modernized cockpit includes new multifunction displays, an updated flight management computer, and improved communications and navigation systems that keep the aircraft compatible with the evolving airspace management requirements of both civilian and military environments. The KC-135 has been produced in a variety of specialized variants beyond the primary tanker role that deserve mention because they illustrate the extraordinary versatility of the basic airframe. The RC-135 family of reconnaissance aircraft, which is visually similar to the KC-135 but carries entirely different mission equipment, is among the most important intelligence collection platforms in the American military. The RC-135V and W rivet joint variants carry sophisticated signals intelligence collection systems that monitor communications and radar emissions over wide areas, providing intelligence that shapes the planning of every air campaign in which they participate. In epic fury, RC-135s operating from bases in the region have been collecting intelligence on Iranian air defense activity continuously, providing the planning data that allows strike package routing and tanker orbit placement to account for threats that cannot be identified from satellite imagery alone. The WC-135 Constant Phoenix is a specialized variant that uses the KC-135 airframe for atmospheric sampling, collecting air samples that are analyzed for the radioactive isotopes produced by nuclear weapons tests. The aircraft has been the primary American nuclear test detection platform since the 1960s, a capability with no direct substitute in the American inventory. The OC-135 Open Skies aircraft operated under the treaty framework that allowed participating nations to conduct unarmed reconnaissance flights over each other's territory, carrying optical cameras and sensors for this treaty verification mission. The variety of missions that the basic KC-135 airframe has supported over its history, from nuclear deterrence to combat tanking to signals intelligence to atmospheric nuclear sampling, speaks to the fundamental soundness of the original Boeing design. The engines on the KC-135 have changed fundamentally since the aircraft first flew. The original aircraft was powered by Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines, each producing approximately 13,000 pounds of thrust. The J57 was a first-generation military turbojet derived from the same technology base that produced the engines for early jet fighters and bombers. It was powerful for its era but operated on a simple thermodynamic cycle that extracted relatively little energy from each pound of fuel it consumed. The exhaust gases leaving a J57 still contained enormous amounts of unburned hydrocarbons and visible soot, which produced the characteristic dense, black smoke trail that KC-135 crews of the early era remember vividly. At altitude, a formation of KC-135s could be seen from enormous distances by their smoke trails, which was tactically problematic in an era when Soviet reconnaissance aircraft were regularly probing the boundaries of American airspace. The J-57 was also extraordinarily loud. Ground crews working near running J-57s were exposed to noise levels that caused permanent hearing damage despite the ear protection available at the time. And the cockpit noise environment on the original KC-135A was demanding in ways that later engine variants largely eliminated. In the 1980s, the Air Force undertook a massive re-engineering program that replaced the J-57s with CFM International CFM56 high-bypass turbofan engines. The CFM56 represents a fundamentally different approach to jet engine design. Where the J-57 was a pure turbojet that accelerated a relatively small mass of air to very high velocity, the CFM56 is a high-bypass turbofan that uses its core engine to drive a large fan at the front of the nacelle. This fan moves a much larger mass of air at lower velocity. The physics of thrust generation favor this approach enormously in terms of fuel efficiency. Accelerating a large mass of air by a small amount requires much less energy than accelerating a small mass by a large amount, for the same net thrust. The result is that the CFM56 produces approximately 22,000 pounds of thrust per engine while burning fuel at a rate dramatically lower than the J-57, roughly 40 to 50% lower for equivalent thrust output. The re-engined aircraft, designated the KC-135R, was operationally a different machine. The increased fuel efficiency meant that a KC-135R flying to a given orbit location arrived with significantly more fuel available for offload than the original A model had. Estimates of the improvement in offload capability ranged from roughly 50% at short to medium ranges to even more dramatic improvements on very long-range missions where the compounding effect of more efficient crews translated into substantially larger fuel reserves at the orbit. The new engines also eliminated the visible smoke trail, reduced noise to levels acceptable near civilian-populated areas, and dramatically improved the reliability and maintainability of the power plant system. Engine removals and replacements, which had been relatively common events on the J-57 fleet, became rare occurrences with the CFM-56. A small number of KC-135s were re-engined with a different power plant. The Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve operated a variant designated the KC-135E, which used the Pratt & Whitney TF-33 engine derived from the commercial JT-3D, a turbofan used on early versions of commercial aircraft, and also on the C-141 Starlifter and the E-3 AWACS. The E model was less capable than the R model, but represented a significant improvement over the original J-57 aircraft and served the Guard and Reserve forces effectively through the 1990s before being retired. The avionics suite of the KC-135 has been through multiple generations of modernization. The original KC-135A had a cockpit filled with analog round dial instruments, manual navigation systems, and communications equipment that required dedicated operator attention. Navigation was performed primarily by celestial observation on long over-water flights, supplemented by ground-based radio navigation aids when in range. The cockpit workload was high, and many early KC-135 crews carried navigators as a fourth crew member on missions requiring precise, long-range navigation. The current KC-135R cockpit reflects decades of incremental modernization. A comprehensive avionics update program replaced the original instruments with a glass cockpit featuring multifunction digital displays that present flight, navigation, engine, and systems information in integrated formats. The navigation system now incorporates ring laser gyro inertial navigation units coupled with GPS receivers, giving the aircraft navigation accuracy measured in meters. The communications suite includes satellite communications capability, allowing the KC-135 to maintain contact with controlling agencies even over vast ocean or remote land areas that lie beyond the range of conventional radio. The fuel management system has been updated to provide the crew with continuous, accurate information about the fuel state in every tank, the offload available for receivers at any point in the mission, and predicted fuel states at recovery under various scenarios. This information is critical for the real-time decisions that tanker crews must make in combat, when the situation may diverge from what was planned, and when the crew must decide on the spot how much fuel they can give to a receiver without compromising their own ability to get home. One of the less discussed but operationally significant capabilities of the KC-135 is its ability to function as an airborne communications relay. The aircraft's communication systems allow it to serve as a node in theater communication networks, receiving and retransmitting voice and data traffic between ground stations and strike aircraft that may be operating at ranges or altitudes where direct communication is difficult or impossible. High-frequency radio propagation is notoriously unreliable, and ultra-high-frequency line-of-sight communications become range-limited at the altitudes where tactical aircraft operate. A KC-135 orbiting at high altitude in a favorable geographic position can relay communications over ranges that would otherwise be unreachable, keeping strike packages in contact with their controlling agencies throughout missions that take them to the geographic margins of the theater communication architecture. The KC-135 also carries classified defensive systems. What is known from open sources is that the aircraft has been equipped with radar warning receivers that provide the crew with audio and visual alerts when an adversary radar system illuminates the aircraft, whether in search, acquisition, or tracking mode. The system can identify the type of radar based on its frequency and pulse characteristics, giving the crew information about what system is threatening them and how serious the threat is. The aircraft carries chaff dispensers that release bundles of metallic foil cut to specific lengths to create radar returns capable of seducing radar-guided missiles, and infrared flare dispensers that release burning pyrotechnic devices designed to attract heat-seeking missiles away from the aircraft's engine exhaust plume. The KC-135 is not a combat aircraft and cannot defend itself through maneuvering the way a fighter can. Its primary defense is through positioning, staying in orbits that are far enough from known threat systems that no realistic engagement opportunity exists, and relying on friendly fighters to maintain air superiority over the tanker tracks. When air superiority is contested, or when threat boundaries are uncertain, the tanker orbits must be positioned conservatively, which increases the distances that strike aircraft must travel and reduces the fuel they have available for the actual strike mission. The crew of a KC-135 on a combat sortie typically consists of 2 pilots and a boom operator. The aircraft is certified for 2-person crew operations across its full flight envelope, and the modern glass cockpit and automated systems have made this workable even on very long missions. The pilot and co-pilot share flying duties and systems management responsibilities, trading the flying pilot role at intervals to manage fatigue on missions that may last 10 to 15 hours or more. The physical demands on a tanker crew during a long combat mission are significant and are not widely appreciated by those who associate combat aviation exclusively with the experience of fighter pilots. A KC-135 crew on a 12-hour combat sortie will execute multiple refueling contacts, each requiring sustained concentration and precise flying. They will manage fuel states and receiver sequencing throughout the mission, making continuous calculations about how much fuel they can give to each receiver while preserving their own ability to complete the mission and recover safely. They will maintain continuous radio watch on multiple frequencies, coordinate with controlling agencies, and monitor a complex information picture that includes weather, threats, receiver aircraft status, and their own system's health. At the end of 12 or more hours of this work, they will fly an instrument approach to a base that may itself be under threat and land the aircraft safely. The absence of G-forces and afterburner does not make the job easy. The logistics of tanker operations in a major combat campaign are staggering in their complexity and scale. Each KC-135 requires a significant maintenance effort simply to remain airworthy and mission-capable. The Air Force measures maintenance burden in terms of maintenance man-hours per flight hour, and for the KC-135, the figure runs into the tens of man-hours for every hour the aircraft spends in the air. Across a fleet of dozens of aircraft operating from a combat theater base, the maintenance workforce is enormous, and the logistics pipeline supporting them with parts, tools, and consumable materials must be carefully managed. The fuel that the KC-135 consumes for its own propulsion is itself a major logistics factor. A KC-135R flying a 12-hour mission burns approximately 35 to 45,000 kilograms of jet fuel for its own engines before any fuel is transferred to receivers. In a theater where the tanker fleet is flying dozens of sorties per day, the fuel consumption of the tankers themselves adds tens of millions of kilograms to the theater fuel requirement each week. Now, to understand how the KC-135 came to be the aircraft it is today, you have to go back to the early 1950s, to a moment when American air power was undergoing one of the most fundamental transformations in its history. The story of the KC-135 begins with a problem. The United States Air Force, in the early years of the Cold War, was building a nuclear deterrent force based around long-range jet bombers. The B-47 Stratojet had entered service in the early 1950s as the first swept-wing jet bomber in the Air Force inventory. It was a remarkable aircraft for its time, fast and capable, but it required aerial refueling to reach targets in the Soviet Union from bases in the continental United States. The B-52 Stratofortress was in development and would enter service in the mid-1950s as an even more capable long-range platform. Both aircraft needed to be refueled in flight to fulfill their strategic missions, and the tanker force that existed to refuel them was based on piston-powered aircraft derived from Second World War bomber designs. The KC-97 was the primary tanker in service when the B-47 and early B-52 were entering the inventory. The KC-97 was derived from the B-29 and later B-50 Superfortress designs, and was powered by 4 reciprocating engines driving large propellers. It was a capable aircraft within its design parameters, but those parameters were fundamentally mismatched with the needs of jet-powered receivers. The KC-97 cruised at roughly 400 kilometers per hour and at altitudes typically below 7,000 meters. The B-47 and B-52 cruised at more than 800 kilometers per hour and preferred altitudes above 10,000 meters. To refuel from a KC-97, a jet bomber had to slow down dramatically, descend to the tanker's altitude, take on fuel, and then climb back up to cruising altitude and accelerate back to cruise speed. This process burned significant amounts of the very fuel the bomber had just received, degrading the efficiency of the refueling event and placing additional stress on the bomber's engines, which had to operate at high power settings during the climb back to altitude. Some KC-97s were fitted with jet engine pods under their wings in an attempt to partially bridge the performance gap. creating a hybrid aircraft sometimes called the KC-97L. The jet pods improved the tanker's speed somewhat but did not bring it close to the performance of the aircraft it was meant to refuel. And the hybrid configuration created its own maintenance and operational complications. It was a stopgap, and everyone who worked with it knew it. Boeing recognized the need for a jet tanker before the Air Force had formally issued a requirement for one. The company had been developing jet transport concepts internally since the late 1940s, driven by two parallel motivations. The first was the commercial market, where Boeing's leadership believed that jet-powered airliners would eventually replace piston-powered transports. The second was the military tanker requirement that Boeing's engineers could see coming even before it had been formally articulated by the Air Force. By 1952, Boeing had developed a design concept called the Model 367-80. The -80, as it was known within Boeing, was a clean-sheet design that drew on everything the company had learned from building the B-47 and B-52 bombers. It incorporated a swept wing derived from the aerodynamic research that had gone into those bombers, four-potted jet engines in underwing pylons, and a pressurized fuselage sized to accommodate either a military fuel load or a commercial passenger cabin. Boeing made an extraordinary decision in 1952. The company decided to build a full-size flying prototype of the -80 entirely at its own expense, without any government contract, as a demonstration vehicle that could be shown to both the Air Force and the commercial airlines. The investment required was approximately $16 million, a sum that represented a significant fraction of Boeing's net worth at the time. Boeing's president William Allen and his board of directors made the decision knowing that if neither the Air Force nor the airlines placed orders for the resulting aircraft, the financial consequences could threaten the company's survival. It was a genuine bet the company gamble made on the conviction that the design was right and the world needed it. Construction of the -80 prototype began in the spring of 1952 at Boeing's Renton, Washington facility. The aircraft was built under tight secrecy and painted in a distinctive tan and brown two-tone scheme. It rolled out of the factory on May 14, 1954, and made its first flight on July 15 of that year, with Boeing chief test pilot Tex Johnston at the controls. Johnston would later become famous for rolling the -80 prototype in a barrel roll over Lake Washington at the 1955 Gold Cup hydroplane races in Seattle, an unauthorized maneuver that demonstrated his confidence in the aircraft's structural integrity and terrified Boeing's management. The flight test program proceeded rapidly, with the aircraft demonstrating the speeds, altitudes, and fuel efficiencies that Boeing's engineers had predicted. General Curtis LeMay, the commander of Strategic Air Command, watched the -80 demonstrations and was convinced. LeMay was one of the most consequential figures in the history of American air power, the architect of the firebombing campaign against Japan, and the driving force behind the creation of a credible nuclear deterrent in the Cold War. He understood what Strategic Air Command needed, and he understood immediately that the -80 solved the jet tanker problem that had been constraining his force's planning. In March 1955, the Air Force awarded Boeing a contract for 29 aircraft, designated the KC-135. The initial contract for 29 aircraft was based on available fiscal year funding rather than on a complete assessment of the Air Force's requirements. LeMay and his planners knew from the beginning that they would need far more than 29 tankers. Subsequent contracts followed rapidly, and the KC-135 production line operated at high capacity through the late 1950s and into the mid-1960s. By the time production ended in 1965, Boeing had delivered approximately 820 KC-135 aircraft, making it one of the largest military jet aircraft procurement programs in American history. The commercial version of the -80 evolved in parallel as the Boeing 707. Pan American World Airways had specified a wider fuselage than the military KC-135 to allow more comfortable commercial seating, and this became the most visible external distinction between the two aircraft. The 707's fuselage is roughly 40 centimeters wider, enough to allow an extra seat per row in the passenger cabin, and enough to make the two aircraft visibly different in cross-section to anyone familiar with both. The first KC-135A entered service with Strategic Air Command's 932nd Air Refueling Squadron at Castle Air Force Base in California on June 28, 1957. The aircraft's arrival was treated as a major milestone. The difference in capability between the KC-97 and the KC-135A was immediately apparent to every crew who flew with both aircraft. Refueling a B-52 from a KC-135A was a clean, efficient operation conducted at the bomber's natural cruising altitude and speed rather than the awkward, fuel-wasting descents that the KC-97 had required. Strategic Air Command began integrating the KC-135 into its war plans immediately. By the early 1960s, Strategic Air Command had developed an operational posture of extraordinary ambition built around the KC-135 and the B-52. Operation Chrome Dome, which ran from 1960 to 1968, maintained a portion of the B-52 force on continuous airborne alert, with nuclear-armed bombers flying patrol routes over the Arctic and the Atlantic around the clock, every day, year after year. The bombers could not stay airborne indefinitely without refueling, which meant that KC-135s had to be flying at all times to meet the bombers on their patrol routes. The tanker crews flew missions of 10 to 15 hours duration, making multiple refueling contacts with alert bombers in conditions that ranged from clear Arctic daylight to North Atlantic storms, in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in seconds if a pressurization problem occurred. Chrome Dome came to an end following a series of accidents involving nuclear-armed B-52s. A crash in Greenland in January 1968 scattered radioactive material from the broken weapons across the ice, creating a massive cleanup operation and significant diplomatic tension with Denmark. The airborne alert posture was discontinued, and the B-52 force returned to ground alert. But the KC-135's role in the nuclear deterrence mission did not diminish. The ground alert posture required tankers to be available at the start of a nuclear exchange to refuel the bombers after they launched, and the growing conventional mission requirements of the 1960s added new demands on top of the nuclear mission. The KC-135 entered its first combat operations during the Vietnam War, and the experience of that conflict shaped the doctrine of aerial refueling for the next half-century. The Air Force deployed KC-135s to bases in Okinawa, Japan, Kadena Air Base specifically, and to Utapao in Thailand and Clark Air Base in the Philippines to support strike operations over North Vietnam. The primary tanker tracks were established over northern Laos, far enough from the main North Vietnamese air defense concentrations to be relatively safe but close enough to the target areas to provide fuel to strike aircraft before they entered the threat and after they exited it. These orbits were given the collective name Young Tiger, and the tanker missions flown from them became one of the defining operational realities of the air war over North Vietnam. The scale of the tanker operation in Vietnam was enormous. At the peak of the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign in the mid-1960s, and during the linebacker operations of 1972, the tanker fleet was flying hundreds of sorties per week. The variety of aircraft being refueled was extraordinary, encompassing virtually every type of tactical aircraft in the Air Force, and some from the Navy as well. F-105s flying strike missions against Hanoi, F-4 Phantoms providing fighter escort and carrying their own strike loads, EB-66s providing electronic warfare support, reconnaissance RF-101s photographing bomb damage, and HC-130 search and rescue aircraft all used the tanker tracks regularly. The Vietnam War produced many remarkable individual acts of airmanship in the KC-135 community. There were numerous instances where tanker crews gave away fuel that left their own aircraft in marginal condition in order to save strike aircraft that otherwise would have been forced to eject over North Vietnam or Laos. The most celebrated of these episodes occurred on August 22, 1968. A KC-135 crew operating under the call sign Young Tiger encountered a formation of strike aircraft returning from targets in the Hanoi area, several of them with battle damage that had increased their fuel consumption beyond planned levels. The strike aircraft were not going to make it to their recovery base without refueling. The tanker crew calculated that transferring enough fuel to save all of the strike aircraft would leave them with barely enough to reach a divert base, with no margin for any further contingency. They transferred the fuel anyway. All of the strike aircraft recovered safely. The tanker crew landed at a divert base with fuel gauges near zero and received the Mackay Trophy for the most meritorious flight of the year. After Vietnam, the KC-135 continued its Cold War nuclear deterrence mission while supporting an expanding range of conventional operations. The aircraft participated in Operation Nickel Grass, the 1973 airlift to Israel during the Yom Kippur War, refueling the military transports that were flying around the clock to deliver ammunition, tanks, and equipment to the Israeli Defense Forces as they fought to recover from surprise Egyptian and Syrian attacks. That airlift delivered over 22,000 tons of equipment in a matter of weeks, and is widely credited with enabling Israel to survive the initial assault and eventually achieve a decisive military position. The Cold War tanker mission was not limited to the dramatic moments of operational deployment. For much of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the most important daily mission of the KC-135 was the quiet, routine support of strategic deterrence that most Americans knew nothing about and gave no thought to. Every day, Strategic Air Command maintained a portion of its bomber force on ground alert at bases across the United States and at 4 locations in Europe and the Pacific. The alert bombers sat fueled and loaded on alert pads, their crews living in alert facilities adjacent to the flight line, ready to launch within minutes of an order. The KC-135s assigned to each bomber base sat in their own alert shelters, fueled and ready, because the bombers that launched in the opening minutes of a nuclear exchange would need aerial refueling shortly after takeoff. The tanker alert crews lived alongside the bomber alert crews, ate in the same dining facilities, and maintained the same exhausting psychological state of readiness for an event that everyone hoped would never come. This daily commitment of tanker crews to the nuclear alert mission, sustained for decades, is one of the least recognized contributions that the KC-135 community made to the stability of the Cold War. The tanker force also played a critical role in the deployments and exercises that kept American military power credible and visible around the world throughout the Cold War. Every time a squadron of fighters or bombers deployed from the continental United States to Europe, the Pacific, or the Middle East, KC-135s flew alongside them to provide the aerial refueling that made the transoceanic transit possible. An F-4 or F-15 flying from a base in the eastern United States to a base in Germany could not do so without multiple refueling contacts over the Atlantic. An entire wing of fighters deploying in response to a crisis could be on the other side of the world within 24 hours, but only because the tankers were there to support the transit. This rapid global deployment capability, which became a cornerstone of American military strategy during the Cold War and has remained so ever since, exists entirely because of the tanker force. Operation El Dorado Canyon, the 1986 strikes on Libya, demonstrated what the KC-135 could make possible in terms of long-range precision strike. When President Reagan ordered strikes against Libyan targets in response to Libyan-sponsored terrorism, the political situation in Europe meant that most American allies refused to allow their bases or airspace to be used. The only aircraft immediately available were F-111 strike aircraft based in England, more than 3,500 kilometers from the targets in Tripoli and Benghazi. Flying around the Iberian Peninsula and through the Strait of Gibraltar added further distance to an already extraordinary round trip of approximately 13,000 kilometers. Each F-111 needed multiple refueling events on the outbound leg and again on the return. The KC-135s that supported the mission flew from England alongside the strikers, meeting them over the Bay of Biscay, west of Portugal, and in the Mediterranean. When the strike aircraft returned to England after what was at that time the longest combat strike mission in Air Force history, the first people the crews wanted to acknowledge were the tanker crews who had kept them flying through the night. The re-engineering program of the 1980s was transforming the fleet throughout this same period. The decision to replace the J-57 engines had been debated for years, driven by the dramatic rise in fuel costs following the oil embargo of the 1970s, and by the growing operational gap between the aging J-57-powered fleet and the performance that modern missions required. Various re-engineering options were studied, including Pratt & Whitney TF-33 engines similar to those on the C-141, before the CFM-56 was selected as the preferred option for the primary Air Force fleet. The modification program ran through the entirety of the 1980s and into the early 90s, with aircraft cycling through modification centers at a steady rate. The first re-engined KC-135R flew in 1982, and the transformation of the fleet proceeded systematically until the majority of active-duty aircraft had been converted. The first Gulf War in 1990 and 1991 was the first major test of the re-engined KC-135 fleet in sustained combat. Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm placed the tanker force at the center of the largest air campaign since Vietnam. The coalition assembled to eject Iraq from Kuwait included aircraft from more than a dozen nations, with widely varying fuel systems and refueling requirements. American KC-135s were refueling not only American aircraft but also British Tornadoes and Jaguars, Saudi F-15s, and a variety of other coalition types. The scale of the refueling requirement in Desert Storm exceeded anything that had been planned for in advance. Tanker sorties ran continuously throughout the air campaign, and the tempo of operations placed enormous demands on both the aircraft and their crews. The numbers from Desert Storm illustrate the scale of the tanker effort in a way that abstractions cannot. During the air campaign, which lasted approximately 43 days from January 17 to February 28, 1991, the KC-135 fleet flew approximately 4,500 sorties and offloaded approximately 110 million pounds of fuel. To put that in context, 110 million pounds of fuel is enough to fill roughly 15,000 standard automobiles to capacity. That fuel enabled the strike sorties that destroyed Iraqi air defenses, military formations, command facilities, and infrastructure with a thoroughness that had never been achieved in any previous air campaign. The tanker effort was not peripheral to Desert Storm. It was foundational. Desert Storm also drove innovations in tanker operations doctrine that have influenced the Air Force ever since. The sheer number of receiver aircraft requiring fuel on each night of the air campaign exceeded what had been planned for in peacetime exercises, and the tanker community developed on-the-fly new methods for managing the flow of receivers through the refueling tracks, including rolling refueling evolutions where receivers joined and departed the tanker track continuously rather than in discrete scheduled contacts. The concept of anchor tracks, fixed geographic orbits with published entry and exit procedures, was refined and expanded. Procedures for refueling receivers with low fuel states on an emergency basis, without disrupting the planned sequence, were developed and standardized. The lessons of Desert Storm were captured in doctrine publications and training programs that shaped how the tanker force operated for the following generation. The post-Cold War era brought sustained high operational tempo alongside new institutional challenges for the KC-135. The enforcement of the northern and southern no-fly zones over Iraq, Operations Northern Watch and Southern Watch, required continuous tanker support for the combat air patrols maintaining the zones from 1991 to 2003. During peak periods, dozens of tanker sorties per week were flown from bases in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait to support these operations. The missions were not dramatic, but they were unrelenting, and they kept the KC-135 fleet at a higher sustained operational tempo than had been anticipated in post-Cold War force planning. Operations Allied Force over Kosovo in 1999 added a European theater demand to the ongoing commitment in the Middle East. The 78-day NATO air campaign against Serbian forces involved tanker operations from bases across Italy, Germany, and the United Kingdom, supporting aircraft from multiple NATO nations over a sustained campaign that required careful tanker scheduling to manage the different refueling systems and procedures of diverse Allied air forces. The KC-135's ability to refuel both boom-equipped American aircraft and probe-equipped Allied aircraft through its centerline drogue adapter made it an essential platform for coalition operations in a way that a boom-only tanker could not have been. September 11, 2001, and the operations that followed placed the tanker fleet under a sustained high-tempo demand that lasted for more than 2 decades. Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan required bombers from Diego Garcia and Whiteman Air Force Base to fly missions of 10,000 kilometers or more, with multiple refueling events over open ocean. These missions, unprecedented in their duration, were made possible entirely by KC-135s flying long orbits over the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea in the dark. The tanker crews supporting those early Afghanistan missions flew some of the longest missions in KC-135 history, orbiting for hours over featureless ocean, making contact with bombers that had already been flying for 5 or 6 hours and that had many more hours ahead of them before they could recover. Throughout the 2010s, The Air Force wrestled with the question of fleet recapitalization while continuing to fly KC-135s at sustained high tempo in support of operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria simultaneously. The Iraq War that began in 2003 placed heavy demands on the tanker fleet in support of an air campaign that shifted from the high-intensity opening strikes of the invasion to a persistent counterinsurgency support mission that required keeping aircraft continuously overhead for close air support of ground forces engaged with insurgents. This persistent presence mission placed a different kind of demand on the tanker force than the strike support missions of the invasion. Instead of a concentrated burst of high-intensity tanker activity in support of a major strike package, the persistent presence mission required a continuous trickle of tanker sorties spread across long periods, keeping individual aircraft on station for hours at a time over areas where ground forces might call for support at any moment. The economics of this mission were different as well, since a single tactical aircraft might need only 1 or 2 refueling contacts during a long orbit, but the need to keep that aircraft on station continuously meant that tankers had to be positioned nearby throughout the entire duration of the orbit. The simultaneous commitments of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, and the ongoing no-fly zone enforcement operations stretched the tanker fleet in ways that revealed the inadequacy of the force structure decisions made in the post-Cold War drawdown. The Air Force had reduced its tanker force in the 1990s based on the assumption that the post-Cold War world would require less sustained overseas military presence than the Cold War had. That assumption proved deeply wrong, and the tanker fleet found itself undersized for the demands being placed on it. The Guard and Reserve components, which operated a significant fraction of the total KC-135 fleet, were mobilized repeatedly and extensively to meet operational requirements that the active duty force alone could not satisfy. Guard and Reserve tanker units that had expected to fly 1 weekend per month and 2 weeks per year found themselves deployed for months at a time in support of sustained combat operations. The KC-X competition to select a KC-135 replacement became one of the most controversial procurement competitions in American military history. Boeing competed with a tanker based on the 767 airframe against a Northrop Grumman and EADS team offering an aircraft based on the Airbus A330. The competition was awarded initially to the Northrop Grumman team in 2008, a decision that Boeing protested to the Government Accountability Office on grounds that the evaluation criteria had been applied inconsistently. The Government Accountability Office sustained several of Boeing's protest points, and the Air Force canceled the award and started the competition again. The restructured competition ran through 2010 and early 2011 before Boeing was awarded the contract, and the Northrop Grumman team withdrew rather than protest further. The resulting aircraft, the KC-46 Pegasus, entered operational service in 2019 after a development program that experienced significant cost overruns and schedule delays, and its remote vision boom system problems constrained operational employment for several years after initial delivery. The Air Force has continued to accept KC-46 deliveries and to work through the technical issues, but the delays meant that the KC-135 fleet had to continue bearing the primary tanker burden far longer than had been planned when the recapitalization program began. As of the Epic Fury campaign in 2026, the Air Force operates a mixed fleet of KC-135s and KC-46s. The KC-46 has a more advanced boom system, greater fuel offload capacity, the ability to simultaneously refuel multiple probe-equipped aircraft from wing-mounted pods and a centerline drogue, and a modern cockpit with more capable avionics. The KC-46 also has a fly-by-wire flight control system that provides better handling qualities and reduces pilot workload compared to the older hydromechanical flight controls of the KC-135. In the long run, the KC-46 will replace the KC-135 entirely, and the Air Force is working through the fielding process as deliveries continue. But the KC-135 fleet is larger. Its crews and maintainers carry decades of institutional knowledge that cannot be quickly transferred to a new platform, and the operational experience accumulated by the KC-135 community over 60 years of combat and near-combat operations represents an irreplaceable asset that exists nowhere else in the world. Many of the KC-135's flying combat missions over the Persian Gulf tonight were built in the early 1960s. They have been through multiple engine changes, multiple avionics upgrades, and multiple structural inspections and repairs. They have been kept alive by maintenance programs of extraordinary rigor and by the unwavering commitment of the Air Force to sustaining a capability it knows it cannot afford to lose. What the KC-135 represents, beyond the engineering achievement of an airframe that has remained operational for more than 60 years, is a concept that was radical in the 1950s and that has become so fundamental to American air power that it is now nearly invisible. The concept is that air power is not just about the combat aircraft that deliver weapons. It is about the entire system that enables those aircraft to get to their targets, to stay on station long enough to engage those targets effectively, and to return home safely. The KC-135 is the element of that system without which the rest cannot function at anything approaching the scope and range of modern American military operations. Without it, the combat radius of American strike aircraft is cut dramatically, limiting the geographic area where air power can be brought to bear and giving adversaries defensible sanctuaries that the tanker's existence denies them. Without it, the time on station for surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft collapses to a fraction of what sustained intelligence collection requires. Without it, the ability to mass air power at a decisive point in a distant theater of war is fundamentally constrained in ways that no amount of fighter capability, precision munitions, or stealth technology can compensate for. The tanker is not a force multiplier in the abstract sense that the term is sometimes used loosely to describe any capability that makes other capabilities more effective. The tanker is a force multiplier in the most literal and concrete sense. It multiplies the effective range, the time on station, and the operational reach of everything it supports by factors that transform what is possible from what would otherwise be impossible. In Operation Epic Fury, as in every major American air campaign since Vietnam, the KC-135 is the platform without which the campaign, as currently conceived, cannot be conducted. The pilots who fly F-22s into Iranian airspace understand this. The F-15 crews who carry the bunker-penetrating weapons to Fordow understand it. The electronic warfare crews who jam Iranian radars understand it. The bomb damage assessment analysts who review the results of the strikes understand it. The theater air component commander who signs the air tasking order understands it. And somewhere over the northern Persian Gulf or the Arabian Sea right now, at 2 in the morning, a KC-135 crew is sitting in their orbit, monitoring their fuel state and their communications, watching their displays for the call from a strike package that needs gas to get home. That crew is doing what KC-135 crews have been doing for longer than most of the strike pilots they are supporting have been alive. They are performing unglamorous, essential, irreplaceable work in the dark. They are the force multiplier that makes modern air combat possible. They are the reason the mission happens at all.